Good morning. Today, this lecture is about collaborative city design. We personally think that it is very important to, on the one hand side, have this new technologies for modeling and evaluating city structures and enhancing urban design and urban planning. On the other side, it's very important to know what kind of modes are existing to establish a dialogue in between planners, so to say experts, but as well in between planners and lay people. So this lecture will be about to give you some ideas how actually a better dialogue could be established. And we just started with very strong motivation. Master planning has been subject to major critique, and in some parts of the world it has been replaced by processes and plans that are more participatory, flexible, strategic, and action-oriented. So participatory, flexible, strategic. So it's not just having a mastermind who's enrolling a plan, like it was in the classical view of urban design and architecture. Today it's more about really to have solutions at hand that crystallize somehow together with the people living in the situations next to the situation that needs to be replanned. And the main goals for all the things is that we actually want to increase urban quality. That's all the things that we promise as architects. But how to do that without knowing what's actually going on? And therefore, we have to encourage the use of collaborative and participatory approaches, but how we can use this to link this with these new methods. So that's mainly about this lecture. So what will be the minimum actually in the beginning? We need to define what is actually the planning situation, what kind of stakeholders we have in our planning situation, and which direction we actually want to go. That's our architectural intention, to have solutions adapted to each case. And therefore, we have some ideas what could actually help. Our proposition here that we say we have that methods for collaborative design. Then we have the methods for generative 3D modeling for cities, if it is Rhino or if it is City Engine, for instance. And then we need somehow a technique which enables a loop. To have, on one hand side, kind of solution given by an architect or by a planner or by an urban designer. On the other hand side, we need actually something what gathers the information, what controls the information. And therefore, we will present you a rather unknown technique in architecture called architecture programming. The interesting thing of architecture programming, in a certain kind of way, everybody is doing that kind of technique already, but not in the structured manner. So that we will present later on. So the idea is that we really have this triangles, you can call it like an innovation triangle, established, that you get really like a mutual agreement between all the planning participants. So this could be something like a process for it. Huh? So we have an iterative model. In the beginning, we have like a current state that is defining more or less the problem of our planning scenario. Then we want to actually reach a certain design goal. But to reach this design goal, we need an iteration. And this back loop in this iteration needs feedback, actually, to know what is actually about, what I should change, why I'm wrong, why I'm right, and so on. And this back loop, that's a key point where actually collaborative design comes into play. Besides all the other methods that we will have in later lectures about the performance evaluation of city design, what can be brought as well in that loop. So one could say, okay, in systems engineering, some things like that is actually not new. It's already used like for the last 40, 50 years. We have life cycle models and we have techniques for problem solving. And the basic principles for that are actually that we need to define top-down problem definition. It's not so easy actually in urban design and sometimes questionable. It has to be evaluated each time if it is applicable at all. Then of course we need to structure everything into unified problems. Like we have problems with drugs on the streets. Okay, not so much in Zurich, but there are several locations worldwide, or problems with drinking waters, or air pollutions, and so on. It's like the initial problems that I identified, or maybe like the street qualities are not so good because everything is unaligned. You have so much springing setbacks, for instance, and you want to have a generation of variance here. That you're not just fixed in the end, just that you are still open-minded, so that you not come to the conclusion actually when you started to do that whole process. And we have this life cycle model that we have to keep in mind, the definition of dynamics that helps us to adjust the model. If we are open to it, if we know how our city quarter will develop in the next years, and we have certain kind of dynamics included, then we can adjust. We will have it in the last lecture. We have this exploration parcours lecture where we will have such kind of social dynamics, how a quarter can shift and what kind of results will come up. This is one of those parts here, for instance. And then we have, actually this should be the point where the slides go automatically. This is the next one. Then we have the problem-solving points. And these problem-solving techniques are actually very important then for the collaborative aspect. So we need to know what is actually the current state, what are the politics inside this urban fabric that you have, and what are your design goals, and what is the solution and the evaluation by the stakeholders that you want to have included here. Oops, this was a bit too much. Actually, this computer used to be fast. Okay, stop it. So, and to solve that, you have to keep in mind there are very complex interdependencies that you need to solve here. We have economic requirements, we have ecological requirements, social and political ones. For instance, we have a lot of current planning proposals. Germany is a very nice example always now, because we have Stuttgart 21 there, where everything like that turned out wrong. So then we have quality of life index, which is a very nice performance indicator, which is very important to the stakeholders later on. And we have to think about that we're not just proposing something for local city government, for instance, that we as well have to keep in mind we have private stakes as well involved. If it are stakes from so-called private-public partnerships, PPP, where large investors are interested to give a donation for, of course, their own interest in an area for certain kind of development scenarios, but as well each homeowner is as well a very important partner there. And the problem is that not always in that direction the people are looking eye to eye, face to face. Mostly a so-called debt model is used. So if there is, for instance, an extension of an airport, for instance, it was in Frankfurt in the 80s, there was like an internal consulting, there was an internal decree. Then in the end, the people came, okay, let's publish it to the public, announce it, and just in the latest stage, public communication took place, and in the end, there was just something kind of like advocacy. They just needed to tell why it's good, and everybody didn't understand. The same scenario happened with Stuttgart 21, but there the problem was that with the publication, it was already years ago, and even the different kind of parties, like the Green Party, for instance, they took care very much about that, and they could have had brought the interest already like 10 years ago, But only now, like a year ago, then it come to the big éclat where everybody was against everybody. And in the end, now it stopped, and it seems to be that it even is really too expensive, and the whole planning is actually failed planning if it's not becoming true right now. And even billions have been already spent for until now. So yeah, so that comes really much to the very practical points. If you think that we are actually more playing around with computer-based tools, but in the end, these computer-based tools are used in a certain kind of frame, and this frame is the practical planning approach, and therefore we need to know what is happening here. For instance, why is it failing? Because there are very specialized views, very specialized interests. For instance, if you have an interest of one lobby, just one party pushing their own interests through and maybe trying to, because they have the main land properties there in that area, because they like to dictate it from there. Then it only takes some portions of the public shares which are not represented fully, for instance. It's not necessary that it's meant to be represented fully, but in the end, it needs to be augmented. And if you put the communication at the end of the line, then you don't have usually success. For instance, there was just on this campus here, there was a big problem with the HCI building in front, just at the door of the campus. Like 10 years ago, they already, no, not just exactly 10, like 13 years ago, they wanted to actually start and build the building over there a bit higher than it was acceptable for the inhabitants of Hönckeberg, and then the whole project had been cancelled. I already told you about that last time, but it was really a bad condition. But what was really nice was that a new process had been started. ETH learned from that. It's not just university directly enabled by the federal government, and that it has some right to build on federal property something, what it wants to do, that it really has to go into the dialogue with the public and exchange. In the end, if you don't have in the pocket for your partner or for your stakeholder, then maybe as well your project will be cancelled. So if you don't have a win-win on both sides, then it's as well very problematic to push a project through. So what could be an alternative? An alternative could be that you, in the beginning, you start first a dialogue. You start a dialogue to collect ideas, to bring with a collaborative advisory ideas together and make the first decisions, and then you leverage your public stakeholders to a certain point to help with the cooperative execution. And this is now a theme what had been, for instance, implemented for the development of the Science City campus right here, quite successfully over the last years. But for that, of course, there's a certain kind of overhead to be taken into account. That's actually the origin why it hadn't been used for the last 100 years already in that manner. Maybe if you shift a bit backward into planning culture, usually you had a big investor. If it was an emperor, for instance, and you wanted to have a certain kind of projects in architecture, a big plan was rolled out, or even a dictatorship, for instance, all those big master plans in architecture are very connected to this very imperialistic societies. And there was no need for big discussion, actually. There was just one contractor. But in our modern societies, we need something like a coordination, a briefing, a moderation, a cooperation, a participation, and communication of the project in front when you are developing the project, and just to ensure that you don't have any kind of losses, because you have to switch anything back within the building site already or just before starting. And therefore, we have this different kind of tools. We will just explain a bit more about that. So in generally, we could make a distinction between techniques for direct involvement and techniques for decision support. And of course, one could argue that all that kind of techniques could be used to manipulate your stakeholders as well. So this needs to be clear. Direct involvement is like a one-way informing, is a minimal base. Participation is like you're having like round discussions and first insight into some projects, but actually still the planner has a big hand on it. Cooperation, it is really like on equal eyes to have planning situations discussed. And coordination is then really like from the project management point of view, what kind of means you actually need to bring into, and moderation, of course, as well. So when should happen one technique and not the other? So actually you should have in mind that over a whole, if you make a graph over the potential for collaboration, when you increase collaboration, you increase, of course, potential for conflicts. So it's very important which kind of stakeholders, which kind of representatives you take into account. For instance, when you are more in the initial phase of your planning intentions, then you use the channel for informing. Then participation has already some conflict included, but it can be used to get the first feedbacks. And then if you're really sure that you want to do this job and you want to do this project, a certain kind of cooperation with very specialized group of stakeholders, so you have to screen what kind are your key individuals that you want to include, that you don't get wrong with your plannings, need to be included. And there, of course, you need to have different amounts of coordination and moderation to actually steer that mode. So like you have like a second layer over it. So. Yes. So yeah, communication is something to inform others, interpersonal dialogue, and for the minimum informing, it's really like a monologue, it's just a one-way direction. And if you have workshops here, it's mainly like a symposium where somebody communicates ideas, maybe gathers some feedback from the audience, and maybe you try to motivate the people that they're in the end kind of at least adapting a little bit to your ideas that you have. And that is done quite oftenly. A typical example for that was Mazda, where more or less the investors need to be convinced that this project is a very good idea. And then we have the next step, participation. There we have a dialogue, not a monologue. We don't have a symposium. We have more really like a hands-on workshop. But decisions are made by the project development team. So if you want to have participation, you can gather ideas to make your project idea much better. But still, you're the last one who decides. And as I said, exchange of ideas, decision making, you do consider something from the others, but you rely as well very much on expert knowledge and so on. And the more open it gets, of course, the more complicated it becomes. That's cooperation. When you really have like the project development, you really give certain kind of parts of the project development to the stakeholders actually. So even if they are laymen by nature and they don't have to do anything to do with urban planning, urban design, they can really specify how their neighborhood would look like and so on. But therefore, since they are all untrained people, non-professionals, you need to have a very strict agenda and you need to have a fallback plan if the agenda is not fulfilled. You need to have mandatory standards, what should be the minimum conclusion in the end for each kind of activity that you have. And you need to know what kind of participants should be included. It's not that meant that you really pick yourself the nice beans out of it, out of the bowl. It's really meant then in this scenario, for instance, that you have a certain portion of people that are elected representatives for the later inhabitants. So for instance, for this cooperation example, Science City was a very nice one, where a lot of things have been discussed, and now the master plan is coming into shape even more with the next buildings erected even for the living situations here at Science City. Yes. For all the kind of techniques, you need the support technique for decision support, coordination. That is mainly, it's not moderation strictly, it's really about to get the things right in place, to have the situation, the events planned, and have all that kind information brought together, and that you select the right people. So to say, that's really the overhead for all that kind of activities for the preparation that you need to do. And then we have the moderation, which is very mandatory for all the kind of talks involved, and that you have somebody who is like the steering person, so that everything gets into success. But very important, the moderator needs to have a neutral position, and that's not very easy in each way. And sometimes you may argue, okay, why should I care about that? In a lot of European societies, public involvement is mandatory right now, and but sometimes it's regulated by the Swiss Federal Building Code, but the quality of the public involvement is not regulated so much, and that is one of the reasons why sometimes we have still that huge projects failing, even if you have it descripted by or given by law. So, okay. Just to give some examples, what you could understand on the methods for collaboration for the streams informing, participation, cooperation. In informing, you have the classical channels, like you make some events, like citizens forums or field trips, with the voters, for instance. Then you do some polls, surveys, and interviews, and you can have certain kind of things that you transport through the media, through radio, blog, press, flyers, and so on. That's a typical one-way communication method. And then in participation, we have like public presentations, where you can get some feedback on the presentations, hearings and considerations. That's a very common tool. These both are very formal methods, but informal methods are the more interesting ones, even if they don't have really definite decisions in the end. So, for instance, to have a citizens jury or a future workshop, so that you really see what should be the future of my city or my part of my city, working groups to certain kind of topics. And for cooperation, of course, we have this kind of legal possibilities, but it's not actually, if it's already here, then everything is already too late. But here, there are informal methods like public-private partnerships, where you have a win-win situation for all the investors and for the inhabitants, or round-table discussions, and mediation. This would be examples for cooperation. So yes, this is just a comprehension of it again. So public-private partnership, it's a typical representative for participation method. And then we have this table discussions and mediation. So. Citizens jury is one of the more exciting techniques, actually, where you have like 15 participants. They're really from this district quarter, selected, pre-selected, And they are accompanied only by planners, but they need, very funny actually for us as architects to think about that, but they came actually up with a plan. So they are trained by the planner, by the architect, with some minimal knowledge that they need, and then they come with all the feelings and expressions that they want to have, how actually their quarter could be. There in Cologne, there are a lot of examples where they used it, especially in the 70s and the beginning of the 80s. However, this technique has a very, very high overhead. You need to pay the people. They're usually paid by the local government, city government, and so on. They are not on work. They work for the project. And even if you get a better agreement on the urban developments, one could argue that this is maybe interesting, but not very efficient. The working groups are people that are not really connected to a city's government, but more loosely connected, and they're generally working on ideas like, for instance, we have something like it on a regional scale, like this metropolitan area Zurich, for instance. There's a working group here, and they make decisions what kind of industry should be settled in the region of Zurich, and so on, and what kind of other sustainability goals should be made, or clean tech initiative, for instance, is something like that we have here in Switzerland, typical representative for that. And then we have that future workshops, and they are very strictly organized. We have this preparation stage, critique stage, creativity stage, where everybody can bring anything on top, and in the end, implementation stage, where you come out like with a certain kind of implementation plan. But this all is mainly done with laymen that are not strictly connected to urban planning so much. So, yes, so it all has to do to be implemented together with planning agencies and, of course, stakeholders from the public. So why should we do something like that? All of the ideas are basically that we are saving resources and investments at the end. So even if you have invested like 400 or 500,000 francs in certain kind of work group meetings and so on, maybe through the duration of 2 years, but in the end, if we have a larger investment done in an area, maybe when it's going into some million or 100 million francs, then we're saving in the end, if we do the right decisions and get the agreement with the public, a lot of resources and investments in the end. The other thing is the acceptance of the proposed design. For instance, we had this problem with this concert hall next to the lake. Was it concert hall? Yes, it was. Just last year when it was a rejection for the big hall at the lake. And that you usually, if you have a better participation for the public, at least if they have the feeling that their opinions are taken into account, then you have a better acceptance and a mutual understanding, for instance, for the proposed project. Of course, that helps extremely the designer and the project investors to actually come to an efficient project realization. And therefore, we have, of course, a problem that we have, on the one hand side, we have a specialist, and here we don't have architectural programming, we have actually, here's a layman, so that's wrong. It's a copy-paste mistake. So here we have the layman, the untrained person. On the specialist side, we have the view of the urban planners, the investors. They're already kind of there already, because they're just thinking maybe on the money, hopefully not, but in reality, that's often the case. And then we have the inhabitants that have, at least in Switzerland, a powerful influence what decisions are coming through. And herefore, we have on the one hand side the feeling about the inhabited qualities, where a lot of people have feelings that, for instance, if in Kreis 4 something is changing, they really have problems to see now within the change that certain kind of inhabit qualities, not just the drugs and prostitution, but the other qualities, that they are lost and taken overboard over a longer period of time. And even the existing social structures, that they are erased. And that's the view for an inhabitant, where you can easily get a blocking situation, that you cannot push this project through. And on the other hand side, you have a specialist that is promising, oh, you get enhanced qualities. Look at this bad streets and look at these old buildings with all these bad infrastructures inside. And you get a better design, you save more money for all your heating costs and so on. But the others say, no, it's nice as it is right now, and we should keep it. And so you should find a way how these people can better discuss, because they have maybe the money and the ownership for certain parts, maybe a few ownership, but mostly living there, and they can, if you not do it right, there can be really bad situations. In Berlin, for instance, in Kreuzberg, it's a district in Berlin, there have been like really riots over the last 2 years at some points in the years, because there are like very simple little social structures from block to block, and they are now being renovated, these urban blocks, into very nice modernized buildings actually. But for all the original people cannot afford to live there any longer. But still this district is recognized as a kind of trend district for having certain kind of creative industries there inside, but as well very lo-fi industries and like just simple retails. But also all people, the old society cannot maintain itself any longer in this new situation of increased rents. So of course our representatives in urban planning projects are architectural offices, planning companies and law offices and agencies. And they all speak totally different languages. But they have the same idea that they should maybe change something and develop something. The investors have on the same party. They can be project developers, public-private partnership investors, like big companies like Siemens who want to have a new railway installed or whatever, and housing associations, of course, the banking industry, and of course the private owners. On the other side, you have just more or less weak candidates that usually think that they're overlooked. You have this residents, you have public services maybe from the cities, like schools or other facilities. Then you have companies like small and medium enterprises or large-scale enterprises. And they need to be included into the project development. So we have a project definition phase, goal definition. We have a pre-selection for certain kind of methods, and we take the right method, and then we go to the rollout that actually the planning comes into life, it will be realized. And therefore, we need to ask us so-called 5 questions, very simple questions. First question is, when we use these collaborative techniques, and bring it into play. We just have seen there's a certain kind of structure and we have a certain kind of people that may benefit from it. It should be actually put into that stage when costs for change requests are very low. So in that stage we have as well the possibility that we can change a lot of things still. And this graph is kind of very, seems to be very easy, but in the end, usually all the kind of change requests are coming in the later stage, when you know the most about your project. And that's, of course, the time when you don't have the possibilities, because you have this timely constraints. Everything is already built, or most of the structures are built that you cannot change very much. And why? Next question. That you want to avoid conflicts, you want to have an acceleration of your project, that you want to, from your citizenship, that you want to have some profits from here, your self-interest that you want to have. If something is renewed, maybe your own housing will leverage its value as well, a bit more, increase its value. And politics, they have to communicate the democratic understanding that this project will be a success. So then we have the what. Of course, what are the topics? For instance, we want to have something like this, still in habitat, maintain certain kind of green qualities, open spaces in a project, and certain kind of flexibility involved should be as well maintained. And then it comes to the who. What kind of stakeholders need to be included and involved in that project for the collaborative planning. And you need to schedule the time frame. And then it comes into play, depending on the size of the project, what kind of methods you actually want to use. If you want to use it informing, participating, or cooperating. It really depends as well on all the kind of conflict of interest in between and all that kind of political pressure as well that is there. And now we come to a steering technology that actually helps collaborative design. This is all about the talking and presenting and having all the kind of processes. And therefore, you need a kind of technique that make all that talking become visible into models. A 3D model, for instance. But how do you actually feed the 3D model? What's the interface to get it actually into a 3D model? There comes a technique into play, what we call architecture programming. So the idea is of architecture programming that you make an interview with little design sketches and bringing some little information on a card base, and that you come from there for each kind of scale, similar to the, actually it is a kind of the smart code representation that we had last week, but then brought into a moderation or a discussion. You derive from there urban design patterns coming from the little window details up to the large regional zoning. And these inputs, this structure can be directly used to get it to a procedure model. It's a very efficient technique to gather all the information needed and to cluster it at the right points of detail that you want to have for the procedure model. Currently, we don't have it automatically connected. It's still a manual process. So architectural programming is manual. Deriving from their design patterns is manual, but we have a structure, we have a process there, as you have seen last week with the smart code presentation. And from there we can easily, each of the smart codes, we can easily describe into grammar code that can be used and applied to the procedure model. So we have done this, for instance, already for Swiss Village Abu Dhabi, master project in Master City. Maybe we have some examples here. I'm not so sure, maybe a bit. So maybe a bit more in the beginning about the technique itself. So architecture programming is nothing very new, as you see. It had been introduced for planning buildings in 1977 by Peña. And it has actually been introduced in a more like a university context. So that was at the MIT, as far as I know, I'm right? Yeah. But there are large architectural offices that use that actually for their daily practices. So for instance, maybe some of you know this German office, Hen Architects. They are not building so much heims actually, but they are building a lot of things for automotive industry, for building really like all the factories for VW, BMW and so on, and different locations worldwide. And for them it's very interesting and very necessary to know what the cleaning lady thinks, how processes should be done in a project, what the big project bosses needs to know, how a car is manufactured, how the worker on the band is connecting things, building up the cars, and how he needs some background information if something is not working with the engineer, that everything comes together into play. And for that, they need, from just their point, not for making sustainable buildings, they just want to have it work. They just have a very, very single-minded, maybe, in the first side. They want to have an efficient machine, which is actually fulfilling all the goals that in the end, fantastic car comes outside the building. It is very important what the architect has to deliver there. Without the architect's knowledge, there will be no car in the end in the right place. So he needs really to know how he has to organize all that functional and spatial programs inside the building. So if this works for a building, we argue in our group here, we can use this kind of techniques as well for urban design. And not just to have fancy urban designs, but as well to have functions inside the urban designs and combine it. For instance, some examples, renderings from the proposed design for the BMW Entwicklungszentrum in Munich. And this is a typical representative of so-called programming cards. So actually you have a structure, like you have a figure which is describing something like a very basic expression or functional code. And then you just have a headline and a description for the headline, like bullet points, very simple ones. And you have always the same structure, and you are even restricted in colors. And this whole thing can be brought together with the idea of urban patterns from Christopher Alexander, so that you have a frame, how everything is brought together, what are the design ideas, and it can be linked, as I said, with the procedural model, that you have the right urban patterns in the right place. So we have done it quite a while. For instance, one of the projects had been actually course with the students. Course, for instance, here in the first presentation here, what we have, case study here, was with students and some experts from the Swiss village Abu Dhabi part in Masdar. We did this kind of programming. Here you see some of the cards, and in the end there had been some 100 cards collected. And then you can link that with all the kind of guidelines or what are the things that need to be done, and bring it together and have then a formulation on a big wall, which is covering a lot of different kind of aspects here in detail. We have on the one side facts that are really known, concepts that should be a solution for some facts or additional solutions, and you bring that together on one wall. And this whole wall can be used as a figurative understanding of all the project partners that are involved. So if you remember, we have informing, we have cooperation, participation. You can use this for informing, but even more you can use it for participation. If somebody raises, oh, I have an idea for a concept that should happen in my urban fabric, and then some of the painters, they take it, they make a card, put it on there, of suddenly this person feels important, that one of the opinions had been pulled on the wall. And if all the others agree on that, what had been pulled on the wall, brought here, you have a mutual understanding. You're getting more and more, somehow, even the value of your own opinion is coming here into play. So this is, as I said, still card-based on paper, But this technique will be in the short future, maybe 1 to 2 years, we'll have a digital chain on that. We not just will have that kind of wall, just having it here, like in the value lab. We have the first prototypes actually already brought into life. We don't have it just in the value lab. We can even use all the kind of social networks platforms nowadays to steer and to cover planning sessions as well, to communicate it to the public. Especially if you think that you have all that kind of votings and polls here in Switzerland, that could be an interesting technique actually to educate the people, that they can learn and give you as well feedback how you actually can increase the quality of your project here in that context where participatory interactions between the people and the politics are quite common. So maybe as a recapitulation, we have two kind of patterns here and cards. So one are the fact cards and the design concept cards. So just very important function here. And then we have it a bit more in detail. For instance, we have here, these blue ones have been the facts. Or was it the concepts? Concepts, so. The concept is like we have new ideas that increase an existing surrounding. And as you see, we have here like the supply system for Mazda as food, goods, and services that should be put into, for instance, greenery, that only local plants should be planted. That's common agreement that we don't have kind of vegetation which doesn't belong to that desert-like context. That, for instance, certain kind of space is reserved for planting things locally for urban farming, even if it is very hot. Somehow it has to be like a security balloon, like an airbag included into Mazda, that you even can harvest something on site and not just rely on imports. Or that you could use existing heat for cooking instead of using just electricity, some kind of heat exchanges. Or that you have for all the waste disposal, that you are packaging the waste to bring it outside and you recycle as much as possible. So one of very, as you see, very detailed concept in the end. But these kind of concepts in the end come into architectural shapes because somehow you have to implement it. Then it comes into physical forms. Even more, it comes into forms if you think about concepts for passive design. What will be the shape of my city actually if I have to introduce so-called wind catchers that get the wind from upper airs into the city to bring some coolness or at least air movement? And how it should be actually maintained that we have actually an effect. So there is not much effect if I do the wrong dimensions here. I have to put it right, as well as the shading elements for PV panels, but PV panels is not enough. I still have sun and heat, so I need to have a second layer, for instance, where I have a better albedo effect. Then, of course, I can as well increase the power of the PV panels as well. And then, if I incorporate all that kind of formulations into design, this was student work, for instance, all those passive design guidelines and all this kind of social requirements brought, for instance, here, for instance, you can see it here quite well, the wind towers. Then you come in the end to some dramatic design proposals, what could be a direction, how it could look like in the end. So this is a more detailed view. Okay, that was the first case study with students mainly and some experts from the Swiss village. And then we had a specialist workshop for the development of Porto Alegre in Brazil, where we had as well a lot of very selected, so we had this participatory design briefing and the cooperated, not participation just, was cooperation. We had local planners and specialists included in the project, and they came up with the ideas from transport, from water management, even from the favelas. The representatives came there, from the community representatives from the favelas, and all the social constraints had been as well incorporated. And then as well we did at the university, the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, as well this programming workshop. And this whole workshop had been as well in the same time communicated over the internet, so that people could, it was announced in the magazines, local daily magazines, newspapers, sorry, and then the people could as well bring feedback about the proposed areas, all the kind of things that we have proposed there. They could vote about that. That was then just in the beginning. We came to the definition actually of the goals, and then we made together with the experts like this kind of simulations for different kind of development strategies that could be introduced. And coming from there, we had then in the end some design guidelines established for the to be planned areas, along with change networks, suite networks, for instance, or the kind of evaluations of the performance of the street networks. So the better, the more interconnected are those lines, but as well more likely for congestions, for instance. And we had to define the design catalog along certain kind of means and pictures, how this whole could develop certain areas of the city. All brought together then later on in City Engine and a digital model, seen here and here. We had in the end this communicated and brought as well. Actually, there should have been a picture from an exhibition. Was then communicated all these proposals in an exhibition, where it was then in the full context communicated to the public of the city. So this was actually like a frame how you can very efficiently set up this kind of collaborative design to bring it together, because this is usually what you come just up in the end when you have made your minimal analysis to make in front. Then you have a design proposal, incorporate it, and hope everybody likes it. But if you really try to connect the people that are affected by your designs, and that a very structured way, and if you have a process for that, you can do it quite efficiently, then in the end, you really can conclude that if you have that participatory design framework, you can have the knowledge from all the others, and then you can kind of very successful for the decision-making phases. So for Rio Grande do Sul, for Porto Alegre, it's like this is an initial input for future development scenarios around the World Cup 2014 in Brazil. What kind of means they should actually pursue it, how they could increase their different layers of urban qualities, and as well development scenarios for later on. And therefore, we just show you right now a picture of the future. You see now the Value Lab here. At the moment, what is already working, those guys over there, the video conference is working. Then that we have like this generative approach here. But one of the next examples where especially Lucas Dreyer is working on that is as well that you have different kind of contextual overlaying on mapping of real 3D models along these tables, and connected with what is Antje Kunze is doing with that programming techniques. We really have like that automatically constructed models here. What you're doing now in that course with manual efforts, it's not interlinked that much, will be in 1 or 2 years more and more getting to become in that area, in that direction, which looks now a little bit still like science fiction, but we are really aiming at, and we're not so far away from it. So, I guess it's the last slide. We have another conclusion, so I guess it's the same as before. So, thank you very much. That was it. Do you have any kind of questions?
Have you got any feedback from any of these projects that have been built with this kind of programming?
Okay, the question was if you have any kind of feedback
for
the
ones
projects.
there was at the workshop and the project had been built, what have they said after it? Is it that you can't complain of the project because you were in the designing part, or is it that they think that it's gone too far from the initial state?
Okay, so especially we have a very good knowledge on this traditional applications in architecture.
Yeah.
There we have good knowledge of that. It's very successful, and sometimes it even goes in that direction that it's not very profitable for the architects themselves. There was, for instance, a contract with BMW in Munich to have their first development center reorganized. Maybe if somebody was to Munich next to this Otto Frei Olympia building, there is the 4-cylinder engine tower. And actually, BMW wanted to have a new tower, next tower. And the architectural company came and made an analysis and performed the programming session. Instead of having a new contract for a new building, they just found out, oh, you just have to reorganize your floor plans. And you're then perfectly organized, you don't need a new building. Okay, so at least you got some money for the architectural programming, but in that case, they had been very successful for sustainable, to think, so, if you think sustainable. And in urban planning, so to say, we have now an ongoing research project. It's called Sustainable Urban Patterns. But we use that kind of techniques already to have people from different kind of planning departments, from different kind of architectural offices, actually speaking together. And we are using that technique now to gather new development plans for the Limmatal, where you have a special portion out of it for Altstetten. And that's kind of already kind of successfully implemented, but it's still rather new. It's not a very common technique, so we are actually the pioneers. It's true.